So we're in the third chapter of Bava Metzia, and we're going to be focused on the responsibilities of a custodian. Now, we've already learned, by the way, that if someone finds let's say a lost animal that declines in value, so something like a chicken, you find a chicken wandering around, you have to collect it and hold it until its owner arrives. But it's going to cost money to feed that chicken. And if you charge the owner for the cost of the feed, well, if the owner shows up in a year's time, the value of that chicken is going to be completely eaten up by the cost of the food. So in terms of the lost object, and the Mishnah is always going to compare, by the way, the finder of a lost object to a custodian. In terms of that chicken, the halacha, which we learned in the Mishnah, is that in fact, the finder should sell it immediately for cash. So he can then return the cash to the original owner when the owner shows up. But we'll see in terms of agricultural produce that the practice seems to be a little bit different. So picking up in the sixth Mishnah of the third chapter, someone deposits produce or fruit. Perot could be fruit, could be produce. It's certainly agricultural produce. And we're going to see in a minute that its value can change. It can go, well, it can deteriorate. Hamafkid perot etzel chavero. Someone deposits produce with his friend. Afilu hen ovdin lo yigabahen. Even if it's perishing, he should not touch it. He shouldn't touch it. In other words, he should let it rot. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is going to disagree. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer, yimkor bifnei bet din. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, look, he should sell it before a court of law. In other words, sell it in an environment where there's a third party to guarantee that it's a clean sale, that it's a fair sale. Yimkor bifnei bet din, he should sell before the court of law, mipnei hashev aveda la ba'alim, like someone who returns a lost object to its owners. So we've said that the lost chicken, if it deteriorates in value, is going to be sold. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, okay, the same is for produce. And the Bartanura, the halacha doesn't go according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, except in the case of extraordinary loss. And in the next Mishnah, we'll see what extraordinary loss is. We'll measure out what an ordinary loss is. But the Bartanura just makes one incredibly, what I thought was a slightly emotional point. And we've said before, by the way, that most of the core material in Bava Metzia is about money, right? It's about money. It's not about love, and it's not about emotion, and it's not necessarily about Torah, at least in the grand sense. But we've seen that some of the Agadah in Bava Metzia is about Torah and relative values. Is your teacher more important than your rabbi? And the Bartanura throws in an insight here, which I think comes from the Gemara. Why shouldn't someone touch someone else's produce, even when it's deteriorating? Each person values his own kav. A kav is about 12 liters. He wants his own kav more than 9 kavim of his fellow. In other words, he doesn't want the money. He wants what was deposited, even if it's deteriorating value, if it's less valuable. So, well, what kind of deterioration is normal? Well, let's just move on in the Mishnah. Hamafkid perot etzel chavero, the same beginning. Someone deposits produce with his fellow. He should return it with deductions, or he should take out deductions. And this seems to be a situation where the piles of produce, maybe it's a pile of grain here, that has just been, it's been merged, it's been blended, it's been merged with the grain of the grain of the custodian. So you show up at your neighbor, you say, look, I want to leave you some grain. He just tips the grain into his silo. So we can't really distinguish your grain from his grain. And that means that if there's shrinkage or wastage or mice, well, we can't really see how much your grain has shrunk compared with his grain. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to return it with a standard deduction. And what are these standard deductions? Well, let's see. For wheat and rice, 9 half calves to the core, which is about 2.5%. They're basically 180 kav in a core. So we're saying 9 half cabs. So that's 4.5 cabs. It works out at 2.5%. And by the way, we see exactly the same halacha today in the commodity trading markets. So if you deliver coffee into the warehouse or the futures exchange, you will see some shrinkage in the coffee as just as it dries up. If it's sitting there for months and months and months, there'll be slightly less coffee in terms of weight when you take it out and then when you deposit it. And if you're trading futures, that's really important. But the futures calculations take account of the shrinkage of the coffee, just as we seem to be taking account of shrinkage in the wheat and the rice in the Mishnah. La sorim beladoch, and so for barley and dura, tisha kabim lakor. There we're going to have 9 cubs to the course. That's 5%. La kusmim ulazera pishtin, for spelt and linseed. Shalosh se'im lakor, 3 seah to the core. That's 10%. There are 30 seah in a core, so 3 seah to the core is 10%. And then we're just going to close with a general principle: hakol lefi hamidah vehakol lefi hazman. All is in proportion to the quantity and to the time. Just as when you deposit coffee in a certified warehouse belonging to the futures exchange today. Just as today, everything's in proportion to quantity and time. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is going to object at this point. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri v'chi ma ichpat lahem. What difference does it make? What do they care? Achbarim ochlin vein hamarbe uvein mi kim'ah. The mice eat, actually, whether there's a lot or a little. Rather, he should only deduct a deduction from 1 kur. And I'm intrigued by the fact that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri seems to know a lot about what mice eat, and he's a famous Tanna from the 2nd century. He's a pupil of Rabbi Eliezer, but he's known to be a poor man. And there's a story in the Jerusalem Talmud in Peah that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri used to go out with the second wave of seekers. These are the second wave of people who used to collect the corner of the field. So he'd go out collecting with those who need charity, not even with the first wave, but with the second. And he'd come back. Umevi parnasato shel kol hashana. He'd bring back his income for the whole year by collecting with basically the second wave of collectors from the corner of the field. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is someone who knows about how mice behave. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda omer im hayta midah meruba. If there was a lot, he doesn't extract, he doesn't deduct or doesn't remove any deduction at all. Mipnei shehen motirot, because the produce increases. Now, Rabbi Yehuda's principle is no different, by the way, from the principle of time and quantity, but he has a different view as to what physical processes going on here. And Rabbi Yehuda is saying, look, if we are entering a damp season, so if we put this produce into storage, maybe at the height of the summer, and then we go into the autumn, as the grain gets damp, it actually increases in volume. So we're not talking about deductions for mice or shrinkage for drying. We're talking about increases for increases as the grain hydrates. But the principle is the same, that the custodian does have a responsibility to give back the proper amount to the person who deposited it, taking into account time and quantity, and taking into account the fact that the person who deposited his produce wants his produce back probably more than anything else.